So we're going to be talking now about the Hellenistic period in Greek art. And let's talk first a little bit about what Hellenistic means and really what we're looking at here in terms of history. So the Hellenistic period dates from 323 to 31 BCE. There's a couple kind of important events that frame this so that we understand what we're really talking about. The beginning of the Hellenistic period actually is really dated with the death of Alexander the Great. But Alexander the Great, um, he was an extremely powerful military leader in the fourth century who led armies into Egypt, into the Near East, and basically just conquered the majority of the known world at the time. And Alexander the Great uh, is kind of the key figure that we associate with the beginning of the Hellenistic period. And the other date that we also talk about is the end of the Hellenistic period, which is at 31 BC. So this is the date actually where Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Augustus, who eventually, of course, becomes Augustus Caesar. And at that point, what happens shortly thereafter is that Egypt essentially becomes a possession of the Roman Empire. So these are two real seminal events that frame both ends of this period in history. So now that we have a little bit of historical context, a little bit about geography. When we're talking about the Hellenistic period, we're not talking about the traditional Hellenic centers of ancient Greece. Instead, we're talking about regions that kind of rise in power during this period in history, particularly regions along the Ionic coast and also regions that are in Turkey today. We have Alexandria in Egypt as an important center, Antioch in Syria, and of course Pergamon in Asia Minor, which we'll be talking about in a little more detail when we look at some of our examples. Some other shifts and changes that are kind of interesting when we talk about Hellenistic architecture specifically. Hellenistic architecture tends to break from some of the earlier traditional Greek forms. The temples become quite a bit larger in some cases. We have some temples, such as the temple to Apollo and Didyma, that are just absolutely enormous in terms of scale, even when compared to some of the substantial examples from the classical period. Some of these later Hellenistic temples are truly gigantic. They also tend to break away from some of the earlier traditional, somewhat, basic, roughly 1 to 2 ratio or whatever formats. For example, the temple to Apollo and Didyma that I mentioned is what's called a hypothetical structure. It's open to the sky, so it's not it doesn't have a traditional roof. So we see some unusual formats and some different definite shifts away from some of the earlier traditional forms that we tend to look at during the classical. And we'll be talking about examples particularly here when we look at places like Pergamon and also some other examples of architecture from around the Greek world. So the example that we're looking at here is what's called a stoa. And a little bit of background about the form so you understand kind of what it is that we're looking at. We've talked a little bit about the concept of an agora already, which is this Greek marketplace. If the Acropolis is the spiritual center, the agora is the really the center of the functional daily civic life of the classical Greek. And during the Hellenistic periods, of course, are also central. And you can actually hear in the background, kind of look up, you can see the Acropolis up behind this structure in Athens. So what we're looking at here is the Stoa of Attilos II. Now, this Stoa, as you can see, is in pretty good condition. What you're actually looking at is a reconstruction that was done actually, in the last century. But prior to that, there had been a Stoa here. And this is supposedly a pretty accurate, meticulously constructed reconstruction of the original. But there was a Stoa here created in Athens by Attilos II, who was actually a Pergamine king. But he had studied in Athens as a youth, and so he presented, this, really had it built for the city of Athens as kind of a tribute or a gift. The structure is kind of interesting. So it frames around the agora, the marketplace, the civic center, and a stoa like this would have been used for shops, for lots of daily, other activities and things, but primarily as almost a Greek version of a mall, if you will. There's 2 levels here, 2 stories. Each one had 21 shops, which faced out in the colonnade. The architecture is interesting as well because we actually have a mixing of orders here, and this is something that becomes really something that the Romans pick up on. It becomes a real popular theme, and we'll see this continued in the Renaissance. We have here on the base level Doric columns, these thicker, sturdier, plainer, simpler columns, and on the upper story we have Ionic. Now, the Doric ones, by the way, the lower third of each column is actually left unfluted in order to make them a little bit more resilient against traffic. So again, this is an example of one of these structures that we refer to as a stoa, which would have served an important civic function and also as a center of commerce. So the next structure that we're looking at here, as you can see, it's really a pretty astonishing example of architecture, and you may note really quite unusually that what you're looking at here is in fact located inside of another building. And this is pretty interesting. So the form that you're looking at here, it's a temple to Zeus, or an altar of Zeus rather. And this altar was originally located in Pergamon in Turkey and has been relocated in its entirety to Berlin. So a little bit of background about the site where this comes from, about Pergamon. Pergamon was actually really a kingdom, and it was a kingdom that had been founded by one of the followers of Alexander after the breakup of Alexander's empire. And this kingdom was founded by a man by the name of Philotyros. And this Pergamon kingdom was really very powerful and very, very successful. After the last king of Pergamon died, his name was Attalus III, Pergamon was actually bequeathed to the Roman Empire and became part of the Roman sphere of influence, became part of just of the Roman world. But the site that you're looking at, the structure you're looking at, rather, the Altar of Zeus, was originally part of an Acropolis. And we've talked about the concept of an Acropolis, and this is something that was not unique to Athens, although, of course, the Acropolis in Athens is the most famous, best-known example of an Acropolis. But we actually had a really extensive and beautiful Acropolis located on Pergamon as well, and we'll talk about this in a moment and look at an image. But this is really the best-known surviving building, again, ironically located in Berlin. But the Altar of Zeus that you can see here is a very unusual structure. And they didn't manage to preserve the entire building, but you can see at least the front portico here, the stairway which leads up into the middle. You can also see how clearly this breaks from the classical form, how different this is than the type of format we would expect to see looking at structures on top of the Acropolis, for example, in Athens. So it's an unusual building, and we have this colonnade, which is framed around this massive central stairway, and we have a really extensive and complex sculptural ensemble that we'll look at in great detail as well. So here you can see a plan view looking down onto the actual Acropolis at Pergamon, and you can see, if you look carefully, kind of in the top right section there, where this Altar of Zeus would have been located. Now, as you can tell from looking at this is an extensive site. It included a theater, it included a library, an armory, a palace, several temples, and so very little of the original site survives in any kind of recognizable condition. But the best preserved element of this, of course, is the Temple of Zeus, or the Altar to Zeus, rather, that we just looked at, which has, as I mentioned, been relocated and is now found in Berlin. So we've talked a little bit about Hellenistic architecture there, and we've talked about the Altar of Zeus at Pergamon, and we're going to continue to talk about the Altar of Zeus at Pergamon, but we're going to do it in a slightly different context here. We're going to talk about it in terms of its sculptural ensemble. So before we do that, let's just talk a little bit generally about Hellenistic sculpture so we can get a little bit of an idea of what we can expect to see and how this style of art, this period in art, tends to differ from the classical. So as we mentioned, the Hellenistic period begins after Alexander's conquest, specifically actually after his death in 323. And we've also mentioned already that the center of culture really tends to shift away from the Hellenic centers of Athens, etc., and moves towards Turkey and places like Ephesus, also Alexandria and Egypt. The characteristics of the sculpture, though, of this period are really unusual. So when we talk about classical Greek, we tend to see this concept of idealism and some humanism as well. But the figures, are perfect in terms of their muscularity and their physique. They're godlike. We also see this real focus in this idea of perfection and mathematical ratio, such as we've seen looking at the canon by Polykleitos, his Doryphoros. So that said, when we look at sculpture from this period in time, we're going to see that there's some very different concerns that the artist addresses. In terms of content, we're going to see examples of artwork that do not necessarily represent idealized characters. We're going to see imagery that represents even sometimes the downtrodden, the worn out, the tired, the people who are not necessarily glorified as gods. We see a much greater focus on realism, emotion, common subjects. We also tend to, in general, when we look at this category, see a much greater focus on eroticism and other aspects of the form. So we'll see really a fairly strong departure from some of the subject matter and stylistic tendencies that we'd be familiar with from the classical period. So, taking us back to the Altar of Zeus from Pergamon, here we have an example of the sculptural ensemble from the site. And if we were to take a look carefully at this site, it includes this massive frieze. So the frieze that wraps around this Altar of Zeus, it's quite large. It's 7'6" in height, as you can see here. It's really quite dramatic too in terms of the complexity of the form. What we're looking at specifically is a scene that you may recognize, a scene which we refer to as Gigantomachy. And scenes like this actually wrap the full length all the way around the temple. It's about 400 feet in length. And the Gigantomachy, of course, as we've mentioned, is the battle of gods and giants. And specifically what we see here is Athena, who is engaged in battle with these guys. And you have this incredible sense of power and struggle as she grips this giant by the head, by the hair. You can see his wings flailing behind him. Her serpent wraps around him and bites onto his chest, and she's getting ready to strike the killing blow. We can even see on the right-hand side, we can see another incarnation of Athena. We can see Athena Nike, winged victory, flying in, getting ready to crown Athena victorious. So the two giants here in particular are Alkyoneos on the left, and on the right-hand side is Gaia, who is, kind of almost pleading for Athena's mercy, which is probably not forthcoming. Now, the style of this, we can also see, as compared to earlier examples, is much more dramatic. There's an intense sense of action, passion, power, movement, and also an incredible depth to this sculpture. It's damaged, quite badly damaged in some places, and one of the reasons why it's damaged as badly as it is because it does project so forcefully from the background. These figures are not carved fully in the round, but they are close. They are very, very dimensional. And this is another one of the characteristics we tend to see when we look at Hellenistic sculpture. Here we're looking at one of the most famous and really one of the most elegant examples of Greek statuary that exist. This is a very famous figure known as Winged Victory, also more formally known as Nike of Samothrace. So the figure that you're looking at here, again, is the same character we've talked about before, Athena Nike, again, Winged Victory, this figure who's intended to represent, a victory in battle, etc. And so we often see this image, as you see it here, kind of taken a little bit out of context. The context of this is actually kind of interesting. So the sculpture that we're looking at, this incredible, beautiful, over 8-foot high sculpture of Nike, was originally part of a fountain complex. And so the fountain included the prow of a ship, which was coming in and based up against some boulders. And so when the fountain ran, the fountain would splash water up against the prow of the boat, and you got this impression of this ship, kind of coming in, and Nike coming in and landing on the ship to crown a naval victor. And some elements obviously are missing, her arms and her head. Her right arm would have been extended up in front of her holding a crown, a laurel wreath more than likely to crown the victor. But it's this incredibly powerful image. When we look at the style of this, we have Some really amazing things happening here too. We talked a little bit when we talked about the High Classical period, particularly looking at well, another image of Nike, for example, Nike adjusting her sandal. This sense of kind of wet drapery and the fluidity and the sense of the anatomy underneath. Well, here it's taken even to a fuller extreme. We really get a sense of this powerful anatomy and of the wind whipping this fabric, this chitin that's pulled tight around her body, and whipping it back and forth in the wind and in the spray of the sea. So it's an incredibly powerful image, and the thought of of creating something like this powerful from stone is pretty astonishing, and really a testament to the skill and the craftsmanship of these Greek artists. So if you were to see this sculpture actually located in the Louvre in Paris, this is what you'd see. So of course the most famous part of it there is up on the top. You can see Nike herself. But here you can also see some of the remains of the original ship that it would have been part of a complex with. So you get a little bit clearer idea of how this may have appeared in its original setting. We can really get a very clear idea of just how dramatically different the Hellenistic period is as compared to the earlier classical when we look at two examples side by side. So here on the left-hand side, of course, is Polykleitos' Doryphoros. And the Doryphoros, as we know from looking at it in the context and talking about it during the classical, is an incredible example of this idea of mathematical perfection and the human figure rendered in a really supremely controlled manner. And on the right-hand side here with the Nike of Samothrace, we have this very, very different style and intent. We have this incredibly powerful figure. It's incredibly dramatic and dynamic. This period in Greek history is sometimes actually referred to as a Baroque period. We talk about the Baroque typically as being this period of time that happens after the Renaissance, and we talk about the Counter-Reformation, etc. However, the term Baroque can be used more generally and refer to a very dramatic, exotic format of style like we see here as well. So here we'll look at another key artwork from the ancient Greek world. And this is another example, of course, of Hellenistic statuary. This one is quite rare in that it is, in fact, a surviving example of a cast bronze. As we've already discussed, there aren't a lot of those around. They're kind of unusual. And so this particular example, which is, by the way, in the National Museum in Rome, actually, is really quite striking. And by the way, I should mention that it's not unusual in this period, during the Hellenistic period, to find there's examples of Greek art located in Rome. In fact, once Greece became a Roman possession, Greek art became very, very much in vogue. And really, the Greeks couldn't produce and export enough to meet Roman demand. And so we do see a tremendous amount of Greek art from the Hellenistic period, which was created for Roman patrons. So the example that we're looking at here, it bears some similarities to earlier classical examples, and that we do have this Greek athlete. However, if we look carefully at this Greek athlete, he's not quite what we might initially expect. He's a boxer, that much is clear, but he appears to be an older man. He's not a young boxer. And while he's certainly in excellent physical condition, if you look at his musculature, etc., if you look carefully, you'll actually also see that he has innumerable cuts and scrapes and all sorts of damage and wear and tear, which would be evidence of a pursuit of this type of profession for an extended period of time. He has cauliflowered ears, cuts on his face, which are actually inlaid with copper. And so we get the real sense that this is a beaten man. This is a man who is exhausted, who is worn out, who has paid the price, really, for his profession. And while we do get a sense of this powerful musculature, we also get a sense of a man who is, certainly not idealized. And if we compare that here with another example, we'll see just how different these two really are. So here we're looking, of course, at the Riace warrior. And the Riace warrior we're quite familiar with from our earlier discussion. And these two figures have many similarities. These are both Greek athletes. They're both in bronze. They both have, powerful musculature. But we have on one side this energetic, contrapposto pose, this warrior who seems to be, ready to engage in battle at a moment's notice. And on the other side, we have this aged boxer who appears to be exhausted and withdrawn. He may even be glancing up at the man who beat him. We don't really know if that was part of the original sculptural group. But at any rate, looking at these two, again, with such similar subject matters in some ways, shows us the diversity and the differences that we can clearly see in comparing these two styles of Greek art.